Daniel had always been a quiet man. He was the kind of person who watched the world more than he spoke. Life on the frontier had taught him that silence could be as powerful as words. He was a trader, and sometimes guided travelers through the rugged lands where civilization ended and the wild began. He knew danger could appear at any moment, but he had learned to measure it carefully. Nothing in his life, however, had prepared him for the day he saw her. It was early in the morning when Daniel rode into a small settlement, one that lay quietly along the edge of a river. The settlement was a cluster of wooden buildings, dusty and worn from the harsh wind and the blazing sun. There were people moving about, going about their chores, exchanging goods, or talking quietly in the corners. Everything seemed normal, but Daniel sensed an unusual tension in the air. His instincts, sharpened by years on the frontier, told him something was wrong. As he walked through the settlement, he noticed a group gathered near the edge of town. Curious, he moved closer. There, chained and guarded, was a young Comanche woman. Her posture was straight, her eyes alert, and yet there was a quiet sadness in the way she held herself. She was clearly not just a prisoner. She was someone who had been taken from her life, from her people, and forced into a world she had not chosen. Daniel could feel the injustice in the air like a heavy weight pressing down on him. He approached cautiously, aware that speaking too loudly could provoke those around her. He could see that she was strong, even in chains. There was no begging, no pleading in her expression. Instead, there was something much harder to understand, a kind of calm defiance. Daniel found himself staring, trying to make sense of the feelings that were rising within him. He had seen many forms of suffering before, but this was different. It was personal. He felt a tug in his heart that he could not ignore. Daniel started asking questions quietly, trying to understand her situation. Some people in the settlement were unwilling to answer, shifting nervously or giving vague responses. Others warned him to leave it alone, saying it wasn't his business and that getting involved could be dangerous. But Daniel could not turn away. Something about the woman, her courage, even in captivity, stirred something deep inside him. He knew that helping her would not be easy, and yet he felt that leaving her there was impossible. He spent the next few hours observing the guards, listening to the conversations, and making mental notes. He needed a plan. Acting on impulse had led to trouble before, and Daniel had learned that thoughtless action could have consequences. But waiting too long was not an option either. Every moment she spent in chains was another moment of injustice. By late afternoon, he decided he could wait no longer. He would free her, no matter the risk. Daniel approached the guards calmly, speaking in measured tones. He offered trade goods, favors, and even money. He argued that keeping her captive was wrong, and that releasing her could benefit everyone. At first, the guards were skeptical, suspicious of his intentions. They warned him that interfering could bring trouble, that their masters would not forgive such audacity. But Daniel's determination and clear sincerity began to shake their confidence. He spoke with a quiet intensity that made them pause, making them question whether their loyalty was worth the danger. Finally, after much negotiation and careful maneuvering, Daniel managed to convince the guards to release her. The moment the chains fell away, the Comanche woman stood tall, her movements fluid and confident. She did not rush to leave or express immediate gratitude in the way he had expected. Instead, she simply observed Daniel, her dark eyes measuring him carefully. In that moment, Daniel realized that freeing her was not an act that ended with the breaking of chains. It was only the beginning of something much larger. He offered her his hand, and a gentle, encouraging smile. She hesitated briefly, then accepted, showing that she trusted him enough to move forward. As they stepped away from the settlement together, Daniel felt a mix of relief and unease. He had done the right thing, yet he was acutely aware that their journey was far from over. Every step into the open land was a step into uncertainty. There were dangers ahead, not just from those who had held her captive, but from the wild itself. The wind carried a warning that Daniel could not ignore. The woman, whose name was Tahi, seemed quiet at first. She did not speak in words he could understand, and yet she communicated with gestures and expressions that were impossible to ignore. There was a grace in her movements, a silent strength that spoke louder than any words. Daniel began to notice little details, the way she observed the land, how her eyes flicked to potential threats, and the subtle ways she prepared for the journey ahead. He realized that while he had freed her physically, there was a deeper journey they would share together. One that involved trust, understanding, and survival. As night fell, they set up a small camp near a riverbank. Daniel built a fire, and the glow illuminated Tahi's features. She sat across from him, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Daniel wanted to speak, to ask her about her family, her life, and the hardships she had endured. But he also knew that rushing would be wrong. Respecting her silence was part of honoring her freedom. Instead, he tended to the fire, silently acknowledging the weight of what they had both stepped into. That night, Daniel could not sleep easily. He lay on the ground, staring at the stars, thinking about the consequences of his actions. Freeing Tahi had been the right thing to do, but he understood that right actions often came with complex responsibilities. He thought about the warnings he had received, the dangers that might follow, and the unknown challenges ahead. And yet, despite his apprehension, he also felt a quiet sense of purpose. He had acted with courage, and now he needed to carry that courage forward, not just for himself, but for Tahi as well. By morning, their journey continued. Tahi walked beside him, her steps deliberate and confident. She did not cling to him, but she did not leave either. Daniel realized that her presence was not an obligation, it was a choice. She had accepted his help, but she had also made it clear that she would walk her own path. And Daniel knew that the bond between them would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. Through the days that followed, Daniel observed Tahi more closely. He noticed how she read the land, how she sensed changes in the wind, the subtle sounds of animals, and the hidden signs of danger. He began to understand that her strength was not just physical, it was deeply rooted in knowledge, culture, and experience. And he also realized that his own skills, while practical and useful, could never replace the wisdom she carried with her. They were partners now, each bringing something essential to the journey. The first part of their journey was not marked by adventure alone, but by quiet moments of learning and respect. Daniel learned patience, and Tahi learned trust. They shared meals in silence, watched sunsets together, and moved through the land with careful attention. Every moment was a test of character and resilience. Daniel understood that freedom was not just about escaping captivity, it was about surviving, adapting, and honoring the choices that came with that freedom. By the time they reached the edge of the open plains, Daniel knew that their story was only beginning. Freeing Tahi had changed him in ways he did not yet understand. He had acted with courage and conscience, but he had also stepped into a responsibility that would demand more from him than he had ever imagined. And as they looked out over the vast, sunlit land, Daniel felt a quiet determination rise within him. Whatever lay ahead, he would not walk away from what he had done. Daniel thought that once he had freed Tahi, their paths might soon separate. He imagined that she would return to her people, and he would continue his own journey through the frontier. But as they moved along the dusty trail, he noticed that she did not turn away. She walked beside him, her steps calm and deliberate, as if she had made a decision that she alone understood. At first, Daniel was confused. He had assumed that freedom meant she would immediately seek safety in the company of her own people. But Tahi seemed to have her own plan, one that was not yet revealed. The first morning after leaving the settlement, Daniel offered her water and food, trying to communicate in the simplest ways he knew. He pointed to the trail ahead, then to the horizon, hoping she would understand that he intended to guide her to safety. She nodded once, a small gesture. But it was enough. Daniel realized quickly that she would not rely on him blindly. Nor did she need constant direction. She was observant, aware, and self-sufficient in ways that made him both relieved and cautious. As the hours passed, Daniel began to notice more about her. Tahi did not speak his language, but her eyes were expressive. When a rustle in the bushes made him tense, she would glance toward it with the same careful caution, indicating that she noticed the threat before he did. She seemed to sense danger instinctively, the way someone who had grown up on the land could read its signals without words. Daniel could not help but admire her. She had been through more than most people could imagine. Yet she carried herself with dignity and awareness. Despite the silent understanding forming between them, tension hung in the air. Daniel felt responsible for her safety. But he also knew that guiding someone he barely knew carried risks. He had encountered trouble in the past from men who believed the land belonged only to them, and now he realized that freeing Tahi could put both of them in danger. Yet every time he looked at her, he felt compelled to protect her, to ensure that the choice he had made to release her was not in vain. On the second day, Daniel attempted to start a conversation. Using gestures and a few simple words, he asked her about her family, her home, and how she had ended up in the settlement. Tahi did not respond immediately. But over time, she offered small answers, her gestures clear and deliberate. She pointed to herself, then to the sky, suggesting her journey had been long and difficult. She mimed interactions with people, indicating she had been forced into the settlement against her will. Daniel could understand some of the story through her actions, but much remained a mystery. As they continued, Daniel noticed subtle signs of her strength. She could walk long distances without tiring. Even when he felt exhausted, she carried little but seemed prepared for every challenge. She knew how to find water, where to set her steps carefully, and how to move quietly through areas where danger might hide. Daniel began to realize that she was not simply a woman in need of rescue. She was a capable and skilled survivor. And yet, she had chosen to stay near him, trusting him enough to accept his guidance, but also asserting her own independence at every turn. By the third day, the trail became more challenging. They navigated narrow paths along steep cliffs and crossed shallow rivers with strong currents. Daniel thought he was leading them safely, but Tahi often took the lead, assessing the path ahead with a careful eye. He began to learn from her, following her signals and trusting her instincts. The journey was no longer just about him helping her. It had become a shared experience of survival and respect. They began to rely on each other in ways neither had anticipated. One evening, as they set up camp beneath a canopy of trees, Daniel tried to speak again. He asked her name, and she finally said it in her language, Tahi. He repeated it slowly, committing it to memory. The simple act of learning her name brought a sense of connection, as if recognizing her identity was a small way of honoring her freedom. Tahi nodded, her expression softening slightly, and Daniel sensed a subtle trust forming between them. It was not an immediate bond, but a beginning that promised something more meaningful than words alone could convey. The nights on the trail were quiet, filled with the sounds of the wilderness. Crickets chirped, rivers flowed, and the wind whispered through the trees. Daniel could not sleep easily, thinking about the dangers ahead and the uncertainty of their path. Tahi, however, seemed calm. She would sit near the fire, watching him carefully, her eyes alert, yet composed. There was a wisdom in her silence, a patience that Daniel envied. He began to understand that her presence was not only a test of his courage but also a lesson in humility and awareness. As the fourth day arrived, Daniel sensed that their journey was being watched. He noticed faint tracks along the trail, footprints that did not belong to them. He felt a tightening in his chest, knowing that freeing Tahi had consequences he had not fully considered. People from the settlement might be seeking her, or perhaps other dangers were nearby. He became more vigilant, scanning the horizon and keeping Tahi close. She noticed his concern and seemed to understand without words. Her gaze met his, steady and calm, as if to say, I see this too, and I am ready. By the fifth day, Daniel and Tahi had settled into a rhythm. They traveled together, moving carefully but steadily through the land. Daniel continued to offer guidance, while Tahi shared knowledge through gestures and subtle demonstrations. She taught him how to move silently, how to find edible plants, and how to sense the changes in the wind that might signal danger. Daniel began to realize that their partnership was becoming essential. He could protect her physically, but she protected them both with her awareness and skill. Despite the growing bond, Daniel understood that Tahi had chosen to follow him for her own reasons. She was not a passive companion. She had agency and intent. Every step she took alongside him was deliberate, a conscious decision to trust him while remaining herself. Daniel respected this deeply, knowing that true freedom meant more than escaping captivity. It meant being able to make choices, even when those choices were difficult or risky. One evening, as they rested near a quiet stream, Daniel reflected on the path that had brought them together. He thought about the moment he had decided to act, to free her against the warnings of others. At the time, he had not realized the depth of what he was undertaking. Freedom was not simply the absence of chains, it was a responsibility that could not be ignored, a journey that demanded courage, patience, and understanding. Tahi's quiet presence reminded him constantly that his actions had consequences, and that walking away was no longer an option. As night fell, Daniel and Tahi sat together by the fire. The glow of the flames illuminated her face, revealing a mix of strength, resilience, and quiet sorrow. Daniel knew that her story was far from over. She had endured hardships that he could barely imagine, yet she remained unbroken. He also understood that his own life had been irrevocably changed. By choosing to free her, he had entered a new chapter, one that would test him in ways he could not yet foresee. In those moments, Daniel felt a sense of respect and admiration for Tahi that went beyond words. She had not begged for his help, nor had she pleaded for rescue. She had endured and survived, and now she had chosen to trust him in a world that offered few guarantees. Daniel realized that this trust was a gift, one that demanded he act with honor, courage, and care. Their journey was no longer just about survival, it was about understanding, respect, and the quiet bonds that form between people who face hardship together. By the time the first week of their journey ended, Daniel and Tahi had moved beyond the settlement, deeper into the open frontier. They were no longer strangers, yet their relationship was still new, delicate, and defined by shared experiences rather than words. Each day brought new challenges, and each night offered time to reflect and learn from one another. Daniel understood that their journey would be long and uncertain, but he also knew that he could not imagine turning back. Freedom, he realized, was never a solitary act. It was a path that required attention, courage, and the willingness to face what one had set into motion. And so, with the dawn of each new day, Daniel and Tahi walked forward together. The land stretched endlessly before them, filled with both promise and danger. Daniel no longer thought of freeing Tahi as a single act. It was the beginning of a journey that demanded commitment, understanding, and courage. And as they moved side by side, Daniel understood something he had not expected. That Tahi, the woman he had freed, would not allow him to walk away from what he had done. The days following their departure from the settlement were filled with both quiet moments and growing tension. Daniel and Tahi had settled into a routine of walking, resting, and observing the land. Yet, with each passing day, Daniel could sense that freeing Tahi had consequences he had not fully imagined. Word, it seemed, had traveled faster than they expected. Rumors spread among the nearby settlements that Daniel had taken a bold step in releasing her, and not all who heard it were pleased. By the third week of their journey, Daniel noticed signs of pursuit. Tracks appeared in the soft earth, footprints that suggested more than one person was following them. At first, he tried to ignore it, thinking the tracks might belong to hunters or travelers. But as the signs became clearer, broken branches, scattered animal tracks, and glimpses of figures in the distance, he understood that people were actively looking for them. They were being hunted, not by wild animals, but by men who felt wronged or threatened by Daniel's actions. Tahi noticed the signs too. She had learned to read the land with a precision that Daniel admired, spotting the subtle disturbances that he might have missed. Yet, she remained calm. She did not panic, nor did she cling to Daniel for protection. Instead, she moved with confidence, signaling through gestures and small, purposeful movements, when it was time to hide, change direction, or move more quietly. Daniel began to realize that Tahi's strength was not just physical, it was intelligence, observation, and instinct, honed by experiences that he could not even imagine. As they traveled through forests and open plains, Daniel learned more about her story. Though words were limited, Tahi shared fragments of her past through gestures, sketches in the dirt, and short phrases in her language that Daniel slowly learned to understand. He discovered that she had a family, and that she had been taken from them during a raid, forced into the settlement, and stripped of her freedom. The hardships she had endured were unimaginable, yet she carried herself with dignity, refusing to let pain define her. Daniel could not help but feel a deep respect and admiration for her resilience. Their journey was not easy. The land itself presented challenges: rivers with strong currents, thick forests that slowed their progress, and rocky hills that tested their endurance. Daniel relied on his own skills to navigate these obstacles, but Tahi's knowledge often guided them through the most difficult areas. She could sense subtle changes in the weather, find hidden paths, and detect danger long before Daniel would have noticed. Slowly, he began to understand that their survival depended not only on his physical abilities, but also on her wisdom and insight. One day, while crossing a narrow mountain pass, they encountered a group of men who had been tracking them. The men demanded that Daniel hand Tahi over, claiming she had been taken from them or their allies. Daniel refused, knowing that returning her would be a betrayal of everything he had fought to protect. Tahi, without hesitation, moved to a position beside him, her stance calm but alert. It was clear she would defend herself if necessary, but she trusted Daniel to make the right decisions. Together, they faced the men, using the terrain to their advantage. With careful planning and quick thinking, they managed to slip away into the safety of the forest. After that encounter, Daniel realized that freeing Tahi had changed his life in ways he had not anticipated. He had acted with courage, but courage alone was not enough. He needed strategy, patience, and awareness of the dangers that pursued them. At the same time, he began to understand that Tahi's choice to stay by his side was not an act of dependence, but of partnership. She had skills, knowledge, and instincts that complemented his own. Their journey was evolving into a shared endeavor, one that required mutual trust and respect. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel observed how Tahi interacted with the land and its creatures. She moved with a quiet grace, almost blending into the surroundings, yet always aware of everything around her. She taught Daniel to notice small details: the sound of leaves rustling differently when animals approached, the smell of water indicating freshness or contamination, and the subtle signs of human activity hidden beneath layers of nature. Daniel began to realize that Tahi's freedom had not just been physical, it was also a mastery of survival that he could learn from, if he was willing to listen. During one particularly tense evening, as they camped near a river, Daniel reflected on the nature of their journey. He had believed that freeing her would be a single, decisive act, but it had become clear that freedom was more than the absence of chains. It was the ongoing responsibility to ensure safety, dignity, and choice. Tahi's presence reminded him constantly that actions have consequences, and that doing the right thing often required more than courage. It demanded endurance, empathy, and commitment. Tahi, for her part, was patient yet determined. She did not rush Daniel or demand control, but she made her presence known in subtle ways. When he hesitated in the face of danger, she would gesture toward the correct path. When he overlooked a potential threat, her eyes would narrow and her body would signal alertness. Daniel came to rely on her instincts as much as his own knowledge of the land. He realized that their partnership was built not on words, but on shared experience, mutual respect, and the understanding that they were stronger together than apart. The challenges continued. One morning, as they crossed a shallow river, Daniel slipped on a mossy rock. Tahi was immediately at his side, steadying him and ensuring he did not fall further. It was a small moment, but it underscored the delicate balance of trust between them. Daniel had saved her once, but now she was saving him. He felt a deep sense of humility, recognizing that their journey was not a one-sided act of heroism, but a shared effort to survive and navigate the dangers that surrounded them. As they moved deeper into the frontier, Daniel also noticed the changing seasons. The days grew hotter, the nights colder, and the landscape itself seemed to shift with the weather. He learned to prepare carefully, gathering supplies and choosing routes that would provide safety and sustenance. Tahi's knowledge was invaluable in this regard. She identified plants that could be eaten safely, locations where fresh water could be found, and places to rest that were hidden from view. Daniel began to trust her judgment completely, understanding that her experience was essential to their survival. Despite the constant threat of pursuit, Daniel and Tahi shared small moments of connection. Around the campfire, they would watch the stars in silence, each lost in thought but connected by the shared journey. Occasionally, Tahi would mimic scenes from her past, drawing in the dirt or pointing to the sky, offering glimpses of her life before captivity. Daniel listened and observed, understanding that these moments were her way of reclaiming identity, sharing her story without words, and teaching him about resilience, hope, and the quiet strength that comes from surviving hardship. The journey was not just physical, it was also emotional. Daniel began to feel a sense of responsibility that went beyond simple protection. He realized that he could not walk away from what he had done. Freeing Tahi had been an act of conscience, but it had also bound him to a path of accountability. Every choice he made affected her, and he could not afford to be careless. At the same time, he recognized that Tahi was not a passive participant. She had agency, judgment, and strength that shaped the course of their journey as much as his own decisions did. One day, as they approached a ridge overlooking a vast plain, Daniel felt a mixture of awe and anxiety. The land stretched endlessly before them, beautiful but full of potential dangers. He realized that the frontier was not just a backdrop for their story, it was a character itself, shaping their actions, testing their endurance, and teaching them lessons in patience, vigilance, and humility. Tahi stood beside him, her gaze scanning the horizon, silently reminding him that their freedom depended on awareness, cooperation, and courage. By the time they reached a small grove of trees suitable for camp, Daniel understood that their journey was far from over. Pursuers might still be close. Dangers could appear at any moment, and the challenges of survival were constant. Yet, he also felt a growing sense of admiration for Tahi. She had endured hardships beyond imagination, remained unbroken, and chosen to trust him despite the risks. Her courage, patience, and wisdom had become indispensable to their survival. That night, as they sat together near the fire, Daniel reflected on what he had learned. Freedom was never a single act. It was a continuous commitment to responsibility, trust, and courage. Tahi's choice to stay with him had transformed their journey into a partnership, teaching him lessons he could not have learned alone. And he knew, deep in his heart, that whatever dangers lay ahead, he could not walk away from what he had done. Daniel and Tahi had been traveling together for weeks, and the bond between them had grown stronger with every challenge they faced. They moved quietly through the wilderness, careful not to attract attention. Daniel knew that those pursuing them were still nearby, driven by anger and fear. Yet, he felt a growing sense of confidence not just in his own skills, but in Tahi's ability to guide, protect, and survive alongside him. He realized that their journey had evolved from a simple act of freeing someone into a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. As they approached a narrow valley, the sound of footsteps and voices reached their ears. Daniel immediately recognized them. Men from the settlements who had been following their trail. Panic tried to rise in his chest, but he took a deep breath, remembering the lessons he had learned from Tahi. He signaled her to stop, crouching behind a cluster of rocks while she mirrored his movements. Her eyes met his, calm and steady, silently conveying that she was ready. Together, they observed the approaching group, planning their next move with patience and precision. The men who confronted them were not just hunters. They were determined to reclaim what they believed was theirs. They demanded that Daniel hand Tahi over, their voices harsh and unyielding. Daniel stood firm, knowing that yielding would betray the trust he had built with her. Tahi, for her part, remained composed. She did not plead, fight recklessly, or panic. Instead, she positioned herself beside Daniel, ready to defend herself if necessary, but also silently communicating that she trusted him to act wisely. Daniel spoke carefully, his words measured and deliberate. He explained that Tahi had been taken against her will, and that returning her would be wrong. The men grew angrier, their frustration evident, but Daniel remained calm. He knew that any rash action could endanger both of them. Tahi, understanding the tension, remained silent but alert, her sharp eyes scanning for potential threats or escape routes. Daniel realized that they had to act together. His courage and her instincts would need to combine if they were to survive this confrontation. When the men advanced, Daniel and Tahi moved quickly. Using the uneven terrain to their advantage, they darted between rocks, trees, and shadows, keeping just out of reach. Tahi's movements were precise and efficient, allowing them to stay ahead while avoiding unnecessary risk. At one point, Daniel stumbled on loose soil, but Tahi was immediately at his side, steadying him and ensuring he did not fall. It was a small gesture, but it reminded Daniel that their survival depended on cooperation, mutual trust, and understanding each other's strengths. As they reached the edge of the valley, Daniel noticed a narrow path that led toward a denser forest. It was risky, with steep drops on either side, but it offered the chance to lose their pursuers. Tahi gestured toward the path, indicating her approval. Together, they navigated carefully, moving silently yet efficiently through the rough terrain. Daniel's heart pounded, but he felt a sense of determination he had never experienced before. This was not just about escaping danger, it was about protecting the freedom they had both come to value so deeply. The men who pursued them were relentless. Their shouts echoed through the valley, but Daniel and Tahi's combined skills allowed them to stay ahead. Tahi's awareness of the land, her ability to read subtle signs, and her quick thinking kept them safe. Daniel realized that the act of freeing her had set in motion a series of challenges, each testing their courage, patience, and resilience. But he also understood that facing these challenges together had created a bond stronger than fear, one built on shared experience and mutual respect. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing suitable for resting. Daniel set up a minimal camp, careful not to leave traces that could be followed. Tahi observed him silently, then moved to gather firewood and prepare a small area for cooking. Her actions were deliberate, calm, and efficient. Daniel watched her, realizing that her choice to stay with him was not passive. She had agency, judgment, and the ability to navigate danger independently. Their partnership had grown beyond simple rescue. It had become a shared journey of survival, trust, and understanding. That evening, as the fire crackled, Daniel reflected on the dangers they had faced. Freeing Tahi had been an act of conscience, but it had also bound him to responsibility. He could not simply walk away now. He had to see the journey through. Tahi, sensing his thoughts, reached out with a small gesture, a hand resting briefly on his arm, communicating trust, gratitude, and encouragement. Daniel felt a surge of emotion. He realized that their journey was as much about human connection as it was about physical survival. Freedom, he understood, was a shared responsibility. The following morning brought new challenges. They encountered a shallow but fast-moving river. The current was strong, and the rocks beneath the water were slippery and unstable. Daniel went first, testing the footing and ensuring it was safe. Tahi followed closely, her movements careful and balanced. Halfway across, Daniel lost his footing momentarily, but Tahi was immediately beside him, steadying him and guiding him across. The small act reinforced their growing reliance on one another. Each was capable alone, but together, they were far stronger. As they continued, Tahi began to share more about her past. Though limited by language, she gestured, mimed, and occasionally spoke short phrases that Daniel began to understand. He learned about her family, her traditions, and the culture she held dear. Each story deepened his respect for her and strengthened his resolve to protect her freedom. Daniel realized that freeing Tahi was not just an act of courage, it was a commitment to understand and honor the life she had been forced to leave behind. By mid-afternoon, signs of pursuit reappeared. Footprints, broken branches, and distant voices reminded them that danger was never far behind. Daniel tightened his focus, careful not to leave a trace that could give them away. Tahi moved with him in perfect coordination, silent yet effective. Her knowledge of the land allowed them to navigate difficult terrain, avoid open areas, and find cover when necessary. Daniel realized that she was not simply following his lead, she was actively guiding and protecting them both. Their partnership had become a true alliance, each relying on the other's strengths to survive. Later that day, they reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. The view was breathtaking, with sunlight casting long shadows over rolling hills and distant forests. Yet Daniel knew that beauty was deceptive. Danger could be anywhere. Tahi, sensing his caution, gestured toward the forest below a path that could lead them safely through the valley. They descended carefully, using every skill they had learned together to move quietly and avoid detection. The men pursuing them were persistent, but Daniel and Tahi's careful planning and awareness allowed them to stay ahead. As night fell, they set up camp in a secluded grove. The fire was small, just enough to provide warmth and light without drawing attention. Daniel watched Tahi as she moved quietly, gathering supplies and preparing for the night. He realized that their journey was as much about patience and observation as it was about action. Each day brought challenges, but also opportunities to learn, adapt, and grow stronger together. Tahi had chosen to trust him, and he had chosen to honor that trust through vigilance, courage, and respect. That night, as they sat near the fire, Daniel spoke quietly. He thanked Tahi for trusting him, for staying by his side, and for teaching him lessons he could not have learned alone. Tahi responded with a subtle nod, her expression calm but full of meaning. Daniel realized that freedom was not simply escaping captivity. It was the ongoing responsibility to ensure safety, dignity, and choice. Their journey had become a shared commitment, a partnership that demanded courage, awareness, and unwavering respect. By the end of Part 4, Daniel understood that their journey was far from over. The confrontation with those who sought to capture Tahi had tested their courage, skills, and trust, but it had also strengthened their bond, deepened their understanding of one another, and reinforced the importance of responsibility and freedom. Daniel knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he could not walk away. Tahi had freed him from his assumptions about heroism, courage, and responsibility, showing him that true freedom came with care, respect, and commitment to those we choose to stand beside. The days following the confrontation in the valley were tense but quieter. Daniel and Tahi had managed to outsmart their pursuers, moving deeper into the wilderness, where the terrain was difficult to track and the forest offered cover. Yet Daniel knew that the journey was far from over. Freedom, he had learned, was not simply the absence of chains, it was responsibility, vigilance, and care. Tahi's presence reminded him constantly that the choice to act had set in motion a journey that could not be abandoned halfway. As they traveled toward lands Tahi recognized, Daniel noticed the changes in her demeanor. She moved with a sense of purpose, scanning the landscape not just for danger, but for signs of her people. Her eyes brightened when she saw tracks or the distant smoke of a settlement that hinted at safety. Daniel realized that she was no longer only relying on him, she had regained confidence in her own instincts, using him as a partner rather than a protector. This balance gave him both relief and pride, for he understood that her strength had never been diminished, it had simply been constrained by captivity. After several days of careful travel, Daniel and Tahi approached the edge of a Comanche encampment. The sight of it brought an unexpected rush of emotion. Families were gathered around fires, children running and playing, and elders sitting with quiet dignity. Tahi's pace quickened, but she remained cautious, knowing that returning to her people after being held captive could be dangerous if the wrong individuals were encountered first. She glanced at Daniel, her eyes silently asking for guidance, and he nodded. Together, they approached slowly, careful not to alarm anyone but ready to ensure her safety. When the people of the encampment first saw Tahi, there was a mixture of shock, relief, and joy. She was welcomed with cautious curiosity at first, as her sudden return after weeks of absence demanded explanation. Tahi, however, had Daniel at her side, and she used his presence to show that she had been guided safely. Families embraced her, and there were tears of relief as she was reunited with siblings, cousins, and elders who had feared the worst. Daniel stood quietly, watching, knowing that his role was now to ensure the transition was smooth and that Tahi's return would be celebrated rather than questioned. The elders approached Daniel, asking questions in their language. Tahi translated with patience, explaining how Daniel had helped her escape captivity and guided her safely back to them. The elders listened, nodding slowly, their expressions a mix of gratitude and respect. Daniel felt a warmth he had not anticipated, for this recognition was not for himself, but for the shared courage that had enabled Tahi's safe return. It was a moment of closure, yet also of understanding that the journey had created bonds and lessons that would endure far beyond this reunion. Tahi's family insisted that Daniel stay for a meal. It was a humble gesture, but one filled with deep respect and gratitude. Around the fire, they shared food, laughter, and stories. Daniel listened carefully, learning more about Tahi's culture, traditions, and the values that had shaped her. He realized that freeing her had not been simply a physical act, it had been a step into understanding a life and a community he had known little about. And as he sat among them, Daniel felt a quiet sense of accomplishment and humility, knowing that his courage had been guided by conscience, but strengthened by Tahi's resilience and insight. During the meal, Tahi placed a small token into Daniel's hand, a carved piece of wood. Simple, yet meaningful. It was a symbol of her gratitude, her culture, and the bond they had shared on the journey. Daniel held it carefully, realizing that it represented more than thanks. It was a recognition of mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the quiet strength that comes from facing adversity together. He looked at Tahi, seeing her smile for the first time in weeks, a smile that was not burdened by fear or trauma, but full of hope and resilience. As the evening deepened into night, Daniel prepared to leave. Tahi and her family walked with him to the edge of the camp, where the path back to his own journey began. There was a quiet sadness in the moment, for both had come to rely on each other during the long, difficult weeks. Yet, there was also a sense of completion. Tahi had returned safely to her people, and Daniel had fulfilled his responsibility, not simply freeing her, but guiding her through the dangers that had followed. Before he departed, Tahi spoke, her words simple but powerful. She told Daniel that she had never wanted him to feel burdened or guilty for the choices he had made. His act of freeing her had been courageous, but what mattered most was that he had stayed committed to seeing it through. She reminded him that freedom came with responsibility, and that his actions had ensured not just her survival, but her dignity and the respect of her people. Daniel felt a deep sense of connection and understanding, recognizing that this journey had transformed him as much as it had protected Tahi. As Daniel walked away from the encampment, he reflected on the months of their journey. He thought about the settlement where he had first seen Tahi, chained and quiet, and how that single moment had set in motion a series of choices that had tested his courage, patience, and conscience. He realized that freedom was not a simple act. It was a commitment that extended beyond the immediate moment, demanding vigilance, understanding, and care. And he knew, without question, that Tahi's decision to stay by his side had been essential in shaping the journey, teaching him lessons in trust, strength, and resilience. The days that followed were quieter, with Daniel returning to his travels through the frontier. Yet the memory of the journey with Tahi remained vivid. He thought of her courage, her wisdom, and the quiet ways she had guided him as much as he had guided her. He understood that the bond they shared was not one of obligation or dependence, but of mutual respect and shared experience. It was a reminder that acts of courage and conscience often carry responsibilities, and that true freedom is inseparable from care, trust, and connection. Daniel continued to navigate the wildlands with a sense of purpose and awareness. He traveled carefully, observing the land and the people he encountered, carrying with him the lessons learned from Tahi. Every step reminded him that courage is most meaningful when combined with responsibility, that freedom is most valuable when protected with care, and that the bonds formed in adversity can shape lives in ways that endure far beyond the immediate journey. Months later, when Daniel looked back on the frontier, he remembered the faces of Tahi and her family, the dangers they had faced, and the moments of silent understanding that had defined their journey. He carried with him the small carved token she had given him, a tangible reminder of the trust, respect, and courage that had guided both their steps. And he understood, finally, that freeing someone is not just an act of bravery, it is a commitment to walk with them until their safety, dignity, and freedom are secured. As the sun rose on another day of travel, Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction. The journey with Tahi had changed him forever. It had taught him that acts of courage cannot be measured only by immediate results, but by the lasting impact on the lives of those involved. It had shown him that responsibility, trust, and care are inseparable from true freedom. And, above all, it had revealed that sometimes the people we help the most are also the ones who teach us the greatest lessons about life, resilience, and the strength of the human spirit. In the end, Daniel walked forward, carrying the memory of Tahi, the lessons of their journey, and the certainty that he had acted rightly. He knew he could not undo the past, nor would he want to, for the journey had given him understanding, courage, and a profound sense of connection. And though he would continue his path alone, the bond they had shared, the challenges they had faced, and the courage they had shown together would remain with him forever, guiding him through the wild lands and beyond.